Living Power with Dan Hurst.
John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. This is one of the most elegant, powerful, life-changing verses in the Bible. Because if we can grasp the meaning of this verse, it will radically change not only the way that we think about God and think about Jesus, but also the way we think about ourselves and our responsibility and what we're supposed to be on a day-to-day basis. You're going into this new year with some hopes and some dreams, and certainly along with that, some intimidating challenges. But what you do over the next few minutes with this truth, with this verse, what you do over the next few minutes by focusing on what this verse says and means, and then choose to apply in your life, will literally, and I am not blowing smoke when I say this, it will literally transform your year. It will change 2013 for you if you will grasp what this verse is really all about. It's that powerful. Now, John has introduced his gospel with a bold and dynamic proclamation that Jesus is God. Right out of the chute, that's what he says. He makes that very, very clear in the way that he states it, that Jesus is the Messiah. And he uses a key word to draw the reader in, both the Greeks and the Jews. He draws them in with this word, logos. It is a word that the Greeks and the Jews both understood to represent the creative fullness of thought of God. And so when he uses this word, it meant something to them. They understood that this was significant. And in using that word about Jesus, what he says is, and this is so important to really grasp, what he says is that Jesus is the revelation of how God thinks. Now he's saying that Jesus is God, but when he says that he's the Logos, what he's saying is that Jesus is the way God thinks. So if you want to know about God, then you have to know Jesus. You have to understand Jesus' thought. And John draws on Old Testament thought to validate his statement. In fact, he draws on what the Jews would have known as sacred prophetic proclamations from Isaiah. He challenges them to see how those prophecies are fulfilled and revealed in Jesus. If we looked at that last Sunday, if you missed that, you might get a copy of the study either on CD or go online. Eventually, I'll get those things to Tim so he can put them online. But those keys that John draws from Isaiah are very important to understand the fulfillment of the prophecy in Jesus. Now, in today's verse 14, John makes a very bold statement. He says this, guys, we saw him. This Logos, this revelation of God and how he thinks, we saw him. He came to earth and he lived among us and he proved what I've just told you. All those things that John has just said in the previous verses. So what he's saying is that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these things that he's talked about, the prophetic fulfillment, and that Jesus is the revelation of God. He is the Logos. He is God revealed. Now, this amazing declaration changes everything for the world. I mean, this is a life changer when you come to grips with what John was saying. Because if it's true, every person now has to make a choice. If Jesus is God, am I going to accept and embrace what he says, or am I going to reject it and thereby reject God? That's a critical question that has to be asked. And that's what John is saying. Here's the crux of the matter. If Jesus is God, if he is who he says he is, if he is who he proved he was by his life, then what do you do with him? You either accept it and apply it in your life, and it changes your life, or you reject him. And if you reject him, then you are rejecting God. So, for centuries, men have been debating and arguing and even warring over this challenge. It is the most critical question that man must answer. What do you do with Jesus? What do you do with this Logos? If he is who he says he is, if he is the revelation of God, what do you do with it? And how does that affect your life? And if you believe it, now listen to what I'm about to say. If you believe it, then how is your life different from the one who doesn't believe it? How is your lifestyle different from the one who doesn't believe it? Let's get into this verse and discover how your life might never be the same after this morning. John's first phrase in verse 14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us," is such a remarkable statement because it begs the question, why would God do that? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Why? Why would that be necessary? Why would he feel like he needed to do that? Well, he did it for one reason and one reason alone. Because he loves his creation. And specifically, he loves you. And just as when man breaks an earthly law, there is a penalty for that earthly law. When a man breaks a spiritual law, there is a penalty for breaking spiritual law. The breaking of spiritual law is what we call sin. Being out of God's will, that's sin. And sin is offensive to God. Sin, being out of God's will, is offensive to God. It is offensive because it separates man from God. And just as when somebody offends you, you have to be willing to let them back into your life. In other words, if they want to come back and be right with you, you have to be willing for that to happen. If they've offended you, you have to be willing, if they want to come back, if that relationship is restored, you have to be willing to let them come back into your world, into your life. In the same way that happens, God needed to show his willingness to let man come back and restore a relationship with him. And so, that's why God sent Jesus as a human in his own creation. This one who created the world became created, essentially, as a human, so that he could connect, so that he could relate, so that he could develop a relationship and say to mankind, I do want a relationship with you. And in fact, I want the relationship so badly that I am willing to pay the penalty for the law, the spiritual law that you broke. Yes, your sin is offensive, but I am willing to pay the price for that sin just so that you and I can have a right relationship for eternity. God can't stand the idea of spending eternity without you. And so he was willing to pay that price to do what he had to do in human form so that he could connect with you and welcome you back and restore that relationship. So he paid the ultimate price, his own death, to prove his love for you. Romans 8, verses 3 and 4 says it this way, "For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do." The law could never restore you. Doing all of the right things, obeying all of the law, was not going to make you right with God. Because all the law did was prove how you were out of God's will. So, God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, couldn't do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Now, right now, half of you've just glazed over. I have no idea what that verse means. All right, let me explain it. In other words, by becoming human and paying the ultimate sacrifice, God showed he was willing to forgive that spiritual offense that had condemned you to eternal separation from him. And he made it possible for you to walk, not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. In other words, walk restored in God's will. That's what he did. That's why Jesus came. He came to make it possible so that you could walk restored within God's will. And by receiving his forgiveness, you now are set free from the eternal separation from him. Your sin separated you from him, but by receiving his forgiveness, you have to receive the forgiveness. You have to ask for the forgiveness. God says, I'm offering you forgiveness, but you have to be willing to be forgiven.